Hey guys, Damian Erskine here. Another video lesson instead of an article this week. Not really a lesson, I just thought I'd talk about changing strings and setting up your instrument. I've written a little bit about this in the past, but recently had a few students ask me about setting intonation, adjusting the truss rod, and if there's any things to keep in mind when changing your strings. So I thought I'd address those here. And this bass has been on the road with me quite a bit this year, getting ready to go to Europe in a few weeks. This is the bass I use on the road with Gino Vanelli, so I figured I'd change the strings and do a little video. So let's get to it. First, let's go ahead and just change the strings. Now when I take the strings off, I generally do them one at a time. I'll take off one string, replace it, get it basically in tune, stretch it out a little bit, retune it, and then move on to the next string. The only time I deviate from that is when I want to actually clean and or moisturize my fretboard. I usually just use a little bit of either linseed oil or often I'll just grab just a little bit of Murphy's oil soap and in some water, suds it up, warm water, scrub it down, let it sit for a while, soak in, and then wipe it off, and then get to stringing my bass. But generally speaking, I tend to leave this, the other, I'll do one string at a time, so as to maintain tension on the neck. So let's go ahead and change this first string. I always start with the lowest and work to the highest. This is a 6 string, so I'll be doing my B string. I generally use D'Addario nickel wound strings. I tend to buy the 4-string sets. I stock up on 4-string sets. I either play 4 or 6, depending on the gig. And I buy my B and C strings separately, primarily because I like my B strings to be as thin as possible and my C strings to be as thick as possible. I've just found that to be more of an even sound. And it just works for me. Through trial and error and experimentation, that's what I've come up with. So I get regular light gauge 45 through 100 D'Addario nickel strings, and then I buy, this is a 125 B string and a 35 C string. So let's do this first string and then I'll talk about how I go about getting this set up. I promise I'll speed up through the rest of them. I won't watch you make me change all of them. So first thing I do is determine the length. Now I just use my finger as a guide. This isn't the ideal setup. I'm doing this so I can get it on the camera. Usually I use a full tabletop with towels and everything laid down, as well as this handy dandy, again, D'Addario tool, which basically just a neck support, which is especially handy when doing it on a table or a piano bench. So I've always used my fingers to gauge. I usually go about 6 inches or so beyond the peg. What I'm going for, and this isn't crucial, but I always like 3 good wraps around the tuning peg. 2 is fine, 4 is fine. Any more than that, then it's an aesthetic choice. I just think it looks bulky and clunky. Any less than that, and you might not be getting a good bite on the string. Although honestly I've never had that much of an issue with slippage, but like I said, through trial and error I've found 3 wraps to look solid, feel solid, and get that with about 6 inches past the tuning peg. Then I use clippers to clip. Now instead of leaving the ball in the bridge and wrapping around the peg, I always pull it out. Reason being, you want the string to twist as little as possible. When it twists, it affects the vibration of the string and it affects the sound and the feel. So I always pull the string out, get a good wrap starting high, maybe another one underneath it, pinch it down against the nut, slip it in, and then I use my index finger to hold the string down while using my other fingers to hold the string up and maintain tension on it while I start winding. Making sure to keep the wind underneath. I'm essentially winding high to low. And as you get tighter, they'll grip together. And especially on round wound strings, those round wounds wind up kind of holding the string in place and keeping it from slipping. Now, a lot of this isn't crucial. Some guys just, jam it through the slot and wrap it a few times and it works fine for them. I'm going with what works for me. I have this going through a rack mount tuner, so I'll get about to a B. And then I always stretch the strings. I just pull on it, give it a little tug. It detunes it a little bit. So I'll tune it again. Get a good harmonic on the 12th fret. And if I wind up going a little high, instead of detuning, I always just pull it up to stretch it if it's just a micro adjustment. When it's new, it'll stretch a lot. And I found it's always best when you're tuning. If you overshoot it, I'll usually just detune. If it's a little bit of an adjustment, I might just pull on the string. But I always like to go from low and then creep up into the proper tuning because I just feel like the string is more secure and it's less likely to go out of tune slightly when you tune from low tension to high instead of going too high and then loosening it a little bit. That's just my thing. So now let's zip through, do the same thing for the rest of these 5 strings, and then we'll talk about setting up intonation. Basically everything you can adjust on a bass I'll talk a little bit about. All right, here we go. Alright, now we got all the strings on there and we're all tuned up. Now some of you may have noticed that I was muting my bass by pushing my volume knob down, and I only mentioned this because I figured somebody would ask about it. I've fallen in love with the sound of passive basses, and so this bass was active, but in all of my basses, as a fail-safe in case a battery dies on a gig, I've always had at least a passive active switch or push-pull knob. So volume, this was active when it was down, passive when it was up. I've since, years ago, taken the battery out of it because I never use the active preamp anymore. Although it sounded great, I've really gotten into the sound of the passive basses. All of my Scholl basses are passive now. And so now it's essentially a mute switch, which is actually very cool. I love having a mute switch. So there is that. Now this bass has spent a lot of time traveling around the world for years, and quite a bit this year. I was also forced to check it in my gig bag, which is fairly protective, but it's still a soft case. on a 12-hour flight from, can't remember, I'm going to say Amsterdam to Portland direct. It was something like that. So it spent a lot of time in the unpressurized, freezing cold cargo hold, getting banged around in the soft case. And actually, it's the action is very good. It still feels really good, but I think it could use a little bit of adjustment. So I'm going to talk about the truss rod right now. So many of you likely got an Allen wrench with your base. If not, you can buy an Allen wrench multi-tool, or I have a number of different kits. This one is a Cruise Tools by Groove Tech, which is pretty cool. It comes with a measuring tape, measuring thing, spacers, which I don't use, capos, which I don't use, but a number of Allen wrenches, these wire cutters, and a screwdriver. Pretty handy. Nice zipperable case. I keep everything in it. I also have another pouch I keep in my gig bag to bring with me to gigs with everything I need to change a string or do a quick adjustment. So this action has actually, it's gotten a little low ever since that last flight. So, take my handy dandy truss rod, my handy dandy Allen wrench, and find the truss rod. I know it's in there somewhere. There it is. So, just as you know, with a wing nut or a washer, righty tighty, lefty loosey, same thing applies here. Now, in my mind, I say righty tighty, meaning if I turn it to the right, my action is going to lower. It's going to tighten, essentially, against the fretboard. Lefty loosey, if I turn it to the left, counterclockwise, it'll loosen, in my mind. That's how I think of it, and the strings will separate a little bit from the fretboard. Now, if you want to check the bow of your neck, the best way I've found to do it is to hold your bass out in front of you. I use my thumb to push the string down against the last fret, and then I just sight down it using the string as your guide, and you'll often see if your neck is bone straight, bowed back, or bowed forward. I always prefer just a little bit of a forward bow. I just want it to just a little bit near the end. And right now it's bone straight, if anything tilting back a little bit. So the most important thing to remember when adjusting your truss rod is that you want to make micro adjustments. You do not want to just go crank, 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 and then see what happens. Second thing you want to remember is that your bass will take a while to actually settle into where it's going to be. As soon as you adjust it, something is going to happen, but it's going to kind of creep and settle. Sometimes, you know, I operate under the assumption that it takes about 12 hours before it really settles. I don't know if that's a real number or not, but I know that it does slowly shift over the next few hours. So I like to do quarter turns. You know, if something's way out of whack, maybe I'll do a half turn. But essentially, right now my hex wrench is up at a 90-degree angle, so I'm just going to move it to the left so it's at maybe a 45 from where it is now, and loosen that truss rod just a little bit. Now I can already feel a little bit of a difference. It's ever so slight. And maybe it's just psychological. I can't even really see the difference. But I'm going to let that sit there for a while, and then I'll check it out again tomorrow, and if it still feels a little tight, I'll give it another quarter turn and repeat the process until I have it where I want it. Now, string height is very much a personal preference type of thing. Really, it just takes a lot of trial and error until you find what feels good to you. Too low, you know, you can get very low and it'll be easy to play fast, which is appealing, but at the same time it limits how you can play the instrument. I used to have my action just ridiculously low because I loved how fast I could play, and then I realized it wasn't really that functional on the gig. I couldn't dig in, I couldn't pluck hard, which meant I always had to play with a very light touch, which was, you know, good for certain things, but sometimes you just want to get in there and you know, just pull some sounds out of the instrument. You can't do that when the action is too low. That said, I still keep it fairly low. My general guide is that it's as low as I can get it, but still kind of dig in and play hard and get it to growl and make some noise without just fretting out or clink clink clink, you know, hitting the frets and sounding bad. Now, like I said, I'm still waiting for the action to adjust a little bit. It's actually still a little bit low for me right now. It's about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/16 from my fret to the bottom of the string at the 24th fret. And actually I adjust my pickup height to be about 1/4 of an inch from the pickup to the bottom of the string. I like my pickups kind of high. I know there are optimal distances for certain pickups and strings as per pickup manufacturers. I've just always gone by feel, and I like the way my bass sounds, so I don't sweat it. And also my pickups, I always make sure they're radiused the same as my fretboard, so I get an even playing surface no matter what string I'm on. If your fretboard is radiused and your pickups are flat, that means the middle strings are going to be higher from the pickups. There's going to be more distance between your middle strings than there will the end strings. And that always drove me a little bit nuts. Not the end of the world, but it's just, you know, when you're playing the thing for hours and hours every day, you start to figure out what your preferences are pretty quick. So now, let's talk about the bridge. Another handy dandy, very small Allen wrench. Allen wrench is what you'll use to adjust the saddles. Now I'm going to give you a close-up of my saddles and talk about a few things. Alright, so welcome to the butt end of my bass. So you'll see for each string I have 2 holes. Essentially they just allow you to adjust the height of the string. There's little screws under there that you're turning that lift the saddle from the bass. Again, micro adjustments, and I like to try and adjust both of them evenly so the saddle raises straight up if you have 2 holes. There's different saddle styles. Some might only have 1 screw, some have 3, and if you have an extra screw that doesn't affect the height, then what that usually means is that your saddle itself is adjustable and you can adjust the spacing between strings. And oftentimes when that's the case, there'll be a 3rd screw that locks it in place once you have it where you want it. This doesn't have that, but if there was, I could loosen it, slide this back and forth, and then lock it into place once I have it. I'm not going to adjust my strings because I like where they're at, but again, same thing. If I wanted to, I would start with a 1/4 turn on each screw, lifting it evenly, and I'm going to put it back, to then figure out my height. Sorry if the camera angles were a little wonky. It was a little hard to do that and talk at the same time. Now, I'm not an intonation guru by any stretch. No instrument is perfectly in tune from top to bottom. No fretted instrument is perfectly in tune from top to bottom. I have seen, like, Hendrik Lindner has that bass where the frets squiggle around a little bit to give him a true intonation. I haven't had the chance to check those out. I'm intrigued. It seems like a great idea if it works. But on these, you're always going to be a little bit out of tune somewhere. So you may have noticed that suddenly my angle has changed, as has the bass in my hands. Reason being, went back and watched the video and I wasn't entirely happy with the way I explained adjusting your intonation, and primary reason for that being that I didn't want to mess with the intonation on the shoal bass, because I have it set pretty nicely right now, and intonation has always been for me the hardest thing to dial in, so I'm hesitant to mess with it. So I grabbed another bass, which isn't quite as dialed in, hasn't mattered as much because I don't travel up the neck as much. I stay lower on this bass, but it could use a little bit of work. So this is actually a Marlowe. A cool bass. I'll show you guys, tell you guys a little bit about it, partially because we're going to be dealing with the bridge and it has an unusual bridge. You'll also notice it has 2 jazz pickups and a P pickup. When I got this bass, I took out the pickups it had in it. Somebody had modified it, and I got some Aguilar pickups. Props to Aguilar. I am an Aguilar guy, full disclosure. And I did it passive with volume, tone, and a toggle switch. The toggle switch switches between the P pickup and the front jazz pickup. And having separate volumes, that means I can kind of get any combination. I can just isolate the P pickup. Sorry, I'm balancing it on my leg strings. I can't really play it. Or I could actually isolate the front jazz pickup, either one, or turn that volume down, isolate the back jazz pickup, or any combination there. So I thought that was kind of cool. So let's get into some intonation speak. All right, so forgive the funny angle here. This was the best I could come up with for you in order for you to both see the adjustments I make on the bridge here, as well as the rack mount tuner up here, because both will come into play. One reason being, aside from that being how you check your intonation, you will also want to make sure you retune your open string and or 12th fret harmonic after every adjustment. Every time you move anything, that changes, so you need to kind of reestablish your bass line, so to speak, with the tuning for that string. So, in a nutshell, when adjusting the intonation, you can see on the bridge, each saddle has a screw and spring. Usually there's a tension spring on the screw. Now in order to adjust the intonation, essentially what we're doing is loosening or tightening that screw. When we loosen the screw, this pushes the bridge saddle closer towards the headstock, which will sharpen, I'll get into this, will sharpen the notes we're tuning against. Likewise, lengthening the string or moving the saddle back will flatten it, so to speak. So what that means, because essentially what we're doing, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, I'm no intonation wizard. I figured out much of this through trial and error and then asking a few questions here and there. I don't have the expensive stroboscopes tuners necessarily. I have a strobe tuner. But essentially what I'm going to be doing is checking the tuning of the open string first against the 12th fret harmonic. And they don't actually have to be perfectly in tune, they just have to be the same. Let me see if I can get this as close as I can. Low strings have a hard time registering on these tuners. So that's not too bad. A little flat, but if I plug it too hard, it goes sharp. So 12th fret, close. That's in the ballpark. So next, I just kind of get an approximation. Your bass will never be perfectly in tune from front to back. Something's always going to be out of tune. It's often most noticeable to my ears on major tenths, especially if you hit the third an octave up and an open string. You can really hear the warble in those notes. Let's get these two. Yeah, still close, but you can still really hear the intonation gets way worse right there. So essentially all I'm trying to do is minimize that. And I do that by getting an approximation across the board, generally using different harmonics. 5th fret harmonic, it's a little sharp. 12th fret's a little sharp as compared to my open string. Actually, they're all a little sharp, so they're all pretty much uniform. So I would say I probably don't need to adjust that intonation too much. Again, this isn't the most accurate tuner, but I might, since that 12th fret harmonic is registering a little high, So it's a little sharp. So if I wanted to drop that a little bit, I could just tighten this screw just a hair. And generally speaking, when you look down, you'll notice that these saddles are not all perpendicular with the instrument. They kind of angle upwards a touch. And that's pretty typical, that your lower strings, the B string, the E string, the saddles will be further back towards the butt of the bass, while the higher strings will be a little further forward. I'm sure there's a physics reason I could give for that, but I don't know it. And so I've adjusted the saddle, so now you'll see on the tuner, sorry, it's really hard to get both of these things in there. So I've adjusted the saddle a little bit. Now you'll see on the tuner that the open string is sharp. So we'll lower that, get it back in tune. Like I said, we'll need to retune after every adjustment. I'm trying to use pretty much the same attack for every new note that I tune to. So those are approximately the same. So that's essentially my process, string by string. Get the open string in tune as close as I can. Check the various harmonics. That 12th fret's flat. Yeah, it's all flat. So this rope, I will loosen. No, sorry, I think it's put it down towards the bass. No. I'm loosen. So I'm loosen this string on the A string. Just like the saddle, not the treble. A little forward towards the head side. So a couple quick turns. Just on the straight side, push this really to make sure. That's a little better. Okay. So it's not too far off. For this bass, my ability to do this, I'm calling close enough. That's pretty sharp. So I take this one a little bit. Bring the saddle back to the hair. Retune my open string. Always making sure I don't string too. So these are fairly new, so the stretch is doing it. They're pretty much about the same, they're all just a little flat. Alright, close enough for jazz. So that's the general gist when it comes to adjusting your intonation. It's all about just getting those saddles in just the right spot. The key being that you need a super accurate tuner if you really want to get the job done well. I'm sure that that the pros would have an extra few steps, some things that they check the tuning against. Like I said, I'm just kind of trial and error, figured out a lot of this stuff for myself, and that's how I get close enough. Most of the basses that I tour with regularly, especially ones that I have to play a lot of chords or solo on, play all the registers of the bass, I often get those set up professionally for me, since I'm just not that good of an intonation setter. I can do pretty much everything else, including soldering. Soldering is a great skill. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. You know, get a solder gun, some solder, a wet sponge, and practice making connections. That way if you ever have to fix a pickup or a battery cable, you know, detaches or anything happens, can't count the number of times I've had to solder before a gig or on the road if I can track down a soldering gun. But I digress. So, there's still some warble in there. Like I said, I kind of suck at setting intonation, but I know the general principles, and I just wanted to give you guys an overview for those just getting into setting up your bass. Again, professional will always do a better job than I will, but we got the job done a little bit. So there you have it. And you know, when it comes to setting up my basses, I know how I like them to feel. I very much operate by feel. Pete, whenever I get a new bass from him, he always knows exactly what I like, and they come pretty close, closer than any other bass I've tried, straight out of the box. But I always need to do a little bit of tweaking, and for my money, I never really know if I have it set up properly until I use it on a gig. That's usually when things become apparent. Like, oh, this string's not entirely even across the, maybe one string's a little higher from the fretboard than another, or they're just all a little too low or a little too high. And so often I will use a new bass like crazy on every gig I can, and then I spend every set break making micro adjustments until I get it, until it just feels like home. And my hands always know when it feels right. So that was my very unprofessional blurb about intonation, pickup height, neck adjustments, and changing your strings. I hope that was helpful to some of you. And I will, I'll see you next week. Hey guys, final thought. There's one thing I forgot to mention. So I'll just do a quick little handheld show. And but if you do use active basses, I have found this to be indispensable. The Keith McMillan Batometer. And all you do is you plug that into your bass, hold the button, and it'll give you the readout of the battery. Right now it just does a self-test because it's not hooked to a preamp or a battery. It'll tell you how many volts are left in the battery in your bass. You can also just hold it to the side if you have a battery you find in a drawer somewhere and you're wondering if it's good or not. Pretty handy. That way if you go into a gig and you're like, man, I haven't changed this battery in forever, I wonder if it's about to die on me. You just plug it in, you go, 8 volts. Yeah, I got a couple more gigs left in it. I found in my experience most 9 volts start to kind of crap out around 6 to 7 volts, and the tone starts to get a little wonky, starts to get a little fuzzy, and then all of a sudden it just dies. So I'll let them get as low as 7.5, maybe 7, but then I chuck them and get a new 9 volt. Like I said, these days I don't use many active basses, but the batometer, however you want to say it, pretty great for you active guys. All right, talk to you soon.